one thing is I think solar sites do have to be constructed to a certain standard in order to make grazing possible and safe. That means there's intentionality here and a standard to the development that the firm needs to account for.
This episode features a conversation between Stacie Peterson, NCAT's Energy Program Director and Manager of the AgriSolar Clearinghouse, and Lexie Hain, the country's leading solar grazing expert. It's the third in a series of AgriSolar Clearinghouse podcasts that are being featured on ATTRA'S Voices from the Field podcast. Lexie is a farmer, solar grazer, and Director of Agrivoltaics at Lightsource BP. She co-founded the American Solar Grazing Association and is a stakeholder in the AgriSolar Clearinghouse. She also coined the term solar grazing. Lexie and Stacie discuss the practicalities of solar grazing, how to prepare and manage agrivoltaic sites, opportunities for grazers and solar developers, and how sheep and solar are made for each other. Let's listen.
Hi, and welcome to Voices from the Field. I'm NCAT Energy Program Director Stacie Peterson, and I'd like to welcome Lexie Hain to the show. Lexie is the leading expert in solar grazing in the United States, and she's coined the term solar grazing. She is the founder of the American Solar Grazing Association and the Director of Agrivoltaics and Land Management at Lightsource BP. She owns a farm in New York and manages a portfolio of grazed solar arrays in the Northeast. She's also been a vital part of the development of the AgriSolar Clearinghouse, and she's one of our stakeholders. Lexie, welcome.
Thank you, Stacie. It's great to be here and to be part of the AgriSolar Clearinghouse's ongoing educational podcast.
Thank you so much. So let's start with some background. How did you start grazing at solar arrays?
Well, as a farm owner who was transitioning from selling a business, I needed another enterprise to keep my farm gainfully employed and to keep my farm operating as an agricultural business.
Mm-hmm.
I poked around, my favorite kinds of work to support, and my training had all been in, agriculture, sustainability, and renewable energy,
mm-hmm.
A little bit in renewable energy. And I found solar grazing in the United Kingdom, and I saw that there were farmers using solar facilities with their livestock, and I kind of dug in a little more, and I thought this is really cool. This is really interesting. Like, I wonder if we could do this here. And as luck would have it, my farm's pretty close to Cornell University in the Finger Lakes, and Cornell had been building solar arrays.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, maybe I could do this here. Maybe this is an opportunity I could take advantage of. And long and the short of it, I was able to find one paper on the internet, a single paper from NC State Extension in North Carolina. I called up the author, Johnny Rogers from NC State, and I said, how can I learn more? And it went from there, Stacie.
That's great. And, as you got into this, how long before you realized that solar and grazing were made for each other?
Well, that trip to North Carolina was really formative. The grazed arrays were so beautiful. They were clearly solar pastures. They were verdant, abundant, diverse. And I was immediately compelled to try and continue with the work. Later the grazing work I did in New York confirmed this. It was the best time. The solar facilities they're park-like. There are nests of birds. There's insects sounds. There are creeks. Whenever I had time to appreciate it, which was usually during a flock check or flock move, there was always a gift from nature to reward that time.
That's great.
The other thing, a little more, it practically is, the flocks really thrived grazing on solar, kind of year in, year out. There was always a way, they came back fat. That's a good thing for sheep. And I guess the last thing is, again, hiking around on that terrain, you were able to see just the practical benefit of, on a rocky solar site, lots of rocky outcrops and rough ground, the sheep just are so nimble, and it was clearly something where the sheep could operate and do the veg management safely. So that was why I thought, oh, this really seems to fit well. Here's a natural synergy.
Yeah, that's great. So now that you're working from the perspective of a solar developer, how has that changed your understanding and approach to solar grazing and other types of agrivoltaics?
What an interesting year, Stacie. This is my first year. I'd say I don't think my approach has changed a ton, but my understanding has really deepened. I do still spend hours of my day, talking to farmers, planning the grazing, but I also spend hours of my time planning grazing from, for Lightsource BP, planning them at projects. So I do a lot of project specific planning, and, just a couple things, Lightsource BP does have a mandate that, or a goal of increasing biodiversity across our sites. And, the grazing is a tool there. And so with that as sort of guiding principle, I now have I have a team, and I've spent the year figuring out what all the different departments do and how to bring them together. Because guess what I see with agrivoltaics is you have to have a buy-in or participation at the very least from all the departments at the firm to make this happen. There needs to be an integrated approach to planning, to the sequencing and scheduling. It's detail, agrivoltaics are detail oriented. Even the most simple, you need a team to pull it off successful,y and you need time. I'll just name a couple departments that people wouldn't necessarily think of, but the insurance department has been wildly useful. The construction department, the engineers, business development. I didn't know what business development was a year ago. And here we are, I need their support to create budgets that we get approved so we can implement the agrivoltaics at the site. So I think those are, this meshed concept is really essential, planning and sequence. So I could go on about that for a while, but it's been a great eye-opening year for me. Yep.
That's great. So you've developed a lot of excellent resources over the years, like the sheep grazing agreement template and the solar beekeeping agreement template. Can you talk about some of the important agreements that grazers and developers should have in place, preferably in a contract, before they go on and develop a solar grazing project or an agrivoltaic project?
Yeah, certainly. And I think this is all trending in the direction I see the industry trending in, which is, an increase in the professionalization of agrivoltaics. And so there are some tools that I helped create. Absolutely. I will just also call out the solar grazing budgets. And there are, I'd say, I think we had 3 or 4 budgets that, with a variety of different partners, from extension agents to sheep economists to honeybee economists, we built these tools that are all, I think now, like unlocked Excel sheets. And that is a key ingredient for the planning for both, mostly for the agricultural partner, but also it's a really good lens. I mean, these are open source, so the solar companies can go in and if you're curious, you can see what the real costs are. Their farming operations are capital intensive, and it is essential for that kind of, essential to sort of see, oh, yes, the farmer did indeed have to, they're going to have to spend $100,000 on this. I guess that's why, we have to pay this for that, fee for service. And yes, the contracts are essential. I think we've seen that, we are raising standards across the solar industry for vegetation management. There are more and more formalized expectations around things like pollinator species, pollinator plantings, other types of ecosystem services. So more and more, I think we will see that codified into contracts, and that the grazers, the grazers can be great partners, but the grazers, again, we're going to go back to planning. This is all part of planning. But it's also part of then the certainty that comes and says, I, as a farmer, and I, as a solar company, have built a relationship that we can then, have a multi-year relationship and maybe a multi-year contract.
Great. So while we're talking about money and budgets, Is this a good business opportunity for grazers?
Yes, I would say there is money to be made here directly by the grazing partners. The participating farmers will have their primary business of selling sheep, lamb, wool, other sheep products at the center of this operation. The grazing business then builds on this core farm business. The grazing business adds a revenue stream to this business, and it potentially offsets other operating costs. So, for example, a farmer might normally graze their lamb crop at home for the season, then sell them in the fall. But now you might have that second tier, that secondary income stream. You say, okay, I've got all my lambs, and there they are getting fed on a solar facility instead. So we found it basically doubled our income, our business. So, and I think we've been on record saying that before. It's okay to share that again. That said, make your budgets. Yes. And this is competitive, and the grazers are competing against the landscaping firms and the O&M providers. So, the solar industry is something that likes to watch its margins. It wants the biodiversity benefits, it wants the agricultural partners, but it's definitely operating on spreadsheets too. So,
well, we're talking about that. So from the solar developer perspective, beyond the cultural capital they get by bringing agrivoltaics to their development, are they saving enough in maintenance costs to justify the solar grazing?
So that's a very good question. One thing is I think solar sites do have to be constructed to a certain standard in order to make grazing possible and safe. That means there's intentionality here and a standard to the development that the firm needs to account for. This can often take more time than actual funds. So let me give you two examples. First, perimeter fences. So the solar projects are required to install perimeter fences by the Federal Energy Code. There are many styles of perimeter fence that will meet this code requirement. However, because of this great variation in styles, only some fences will hold sheep in and keep predators out. So that's just a quick thing where a firm can have a standard, and that standard can then facilitate safe solar grazing. The second example would be a water supply. So let's note that providing water is key to the majority of potential agrivoltaic enterprises. And so, this might be something you want to look at in your lease agreements, so very early on. And then there should be a subsequent investigation into, water supply in rural communities. Could be from a well, it could be municipal water, or it might be from irrigation ponds. So again, the key issue is that the solar firm needs to determine which water source will work for a particular site, and then look for a way to optimize the choice. So maybe not spend more money, but then makes the grazing definitely more, the grazer will need to charge you less, and the grazing operation is more likely to be successful. So I think the other part of your question, which was about savings, NREL's written some good papers, and I think we'll write some more. I think what we're going to see is parity with mowing costs, particularly in certain regions of the country. Increasingly, the areas where solar development and where the top sheep states are actually overlapping a little bit more. So the reason that's important is, as this expands, is with that overlap, you're also seeing areas where vegetation management is traditionally more expensive because there's more rain. So in the past, the top sheep states are the states that have the least precipitation.
Learn how to harvest the sun twice with practical information at NCAT's AgriSolar Clearinghouse. Get access to more than 400 peer-reviewed articles, the latest in agri-solar news, and connect with farmers and solar developers who are working together to make the most out of our shared resources. We'll see you at agrisolarclearinghouse.org.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, is there any difference in costs and insurance?
I don't believe there's a difference in cost. You mean for the solar firm to, not that I'm aware of. No, okay. I don't believe so.
Great. What should grazers consider about insurance?
Yes, the grazers will need to have insurance, and specific insurance. This is a requirement. My advice to the grazer is to get started early on this. Check that your insurance firm is willing to insure both your grazing business and the solar site. That is usually a requirement of the solar firm. So if your insurance company does not understand this, you're going to have to shop around and find another business and then get a quote. This can then turn into a more expensive insurance rider for you. So that's worth investigating early. I've seen farmers get hurt by this because you've just got to put in the time. I know it's not fun, but go ahead and do it.
Okay. Well, thanks. That's great advice. Okay, so I was thinking about pollinator habitat too. Pollinator habitat and beekeeping are also an important part of a lot of agrivoltaic sites. Is solar grazing compatible with pollinator habitat?
So this is an important discussion that we could spend an entire hour on.
I'm sure.
So I'll try and tease out a couple components.
Sure.
And generally, I think, I've tried to align the different interest groups here because I felt like that the ecosystem services and the sheep should line up and pollinator habitat should line up as all being in the same, under the same tent, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's considerations for forage and nutrition.
Yes.
I think the first step there, a grazer will know what stage of life, like what the nutritional needs are of a flock or a certain component of a flock. And that is sort of their first job as a grazing manager. So that comes first. But then following that, the grazer will want to have some involvement in, if there's a site being planned, perhaps they can comment on the proposed seed mix. Or if a seed mix has already been chosen and the site's active, just getting a copy of that seed list. And if that's not possible, then visiting the site, which I also just recommend regardless.
Sure. During
the growing season is strongly advisable. One important reason for this level of detailed management is that there are not a lot of species toxic to sheep, but there are a choice few. And so there are a few flowers in particular that a grazer will want to be on the lookout for. And yeah, that could really be problematic. So that would just be the first thing where there's a quick elimination of that concern for your sheep. And then I think the rest is good grazing management.
All right. Can you talk a little bit more about seed mixes like the fuzz and buzz seed mix?
Sure. So the fuzz and buzz seed mix is a seed mix that American Solar Grazing Association developed with Ernst Seeds. And it's essentially, it's actually a series of seed mixes. It's a basis of forage species for sheep, blended with clover and native pollinator flowers. It's suited for solar, so we consider things like height and cost. And every year since we've done it, I think this is about our fourth year, we modify the seed mix based on feedback, how it's growing, and of course, seed supply, so seed availability. I expect that that will continue into next year, and I expect it to diversify further.
Great.
So I also wanted to comment on, seed mix choice and seeding sequences are critical to getting solar sites to improve their biodiversity, lower operational costs, reduce regulatory compliance, and look better, function better. So I'll just unpack that a little bit more and say that this is something I actually spend a lot of time on at Lightsource because they really are focused on biodiversity. The thought and planning that should go into that base for seeding a solar site is really worth doing. And so that's my message back to the solar community is do spend that time. A lot of people already know this, but I think I just want to reinforce, do spend that time. It pays in leaps and bounds.
And when you say reduce regulatory compliance, do you mean that it enables the solar company to be more compliant with regulations, or is there, am I understanding that correctly?
You are, and I should explain, it reduces the opportunity for noxious and invasive weeds.
Oh, that's excellent. Okay. Which leads me to a question. I'm wondering about herbicides and pesticides and, their impact on pollinators, their impact on grazing. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I think we could do a whole session on this. I'll just say a couple notes. One is, as a background, pesticide applicators licenses are needed at solar facilities. Farmers may not need a license on their whole farm, but you do need to when you get to that solar facility. So just a heads up that you're now operating as someone else's property. I guess my message here is, overall, the amount of pesticide, herbicide use will probably be reduced and probably go a lot better, more smoothly, if the farmer grazers take on this role.
Okay.
I do think that there are definitely considerations to, spraying and then exposure to livestock. You want to be very careful. Mm-hmm. The grazer definitely have thoughts and opinions on this.
Sure.
And, your flock might be certified organic. There's a whole, you might be opening a bit of a hornet's nest. So my comment is this is the kind of responsibility that I would encourage the grazers to go get that license and potentially build that into their scope.
Okay.
And I think it will reduce the amount of herbicide use greatly to just hopefully selective spot spraying, which I think we're going to see in the first few years of most solar facilities. There's been construction, there's disturbance, there's opportunistic weeds and noxious weeds. Some of it can probably be done by hand, but some of it will probably be done with targeted spraying. But especially if we are working to establish those dominant native prairies and similar, like those species just take 2, 3 to 5 years to really establish properly, and you have to support them.
Is there a certain, do you have to pay attention to bloom time, anything like that for grazing with the pollinator?
Absolutely. And so this is again, something where there's some pretty active research into this conversation, and that a grazer and a solar firm will want to, I think, come to some agreement on, and later will end up in a contract. So there has to be a prioritization a little bit of like, what's the proposed schedule of grazing? Mm-hmm. For example, if you want to see sequential blooms, you can get into this a lot, but if you want to see a series of sequential blooms and you just wanted to practice rotational grazing, then you would have if you seeded the site with a variety of clovers, you should be able to actually just manage through a rotation that really supports that ongoing bloom sequence, particularly in certain climates. The research that I'm aware of in this space, EPRI has a project in Kentucky that's run by LG&E. I was able to visit this year. Mm-hmm. It is grazed. They are working on sort of some recommendations as a result of that project, which by the way was just gorgeous. Mm-hmm. Kudos to all of them. There's been some projects that I believe show an increase in floral abundance and diversity. Hopefully I got that right, but that Minnesota Native Landscapes, led, and I know Enel and NREL have done some work. So my comment is I think it's a grazing management question. Cornell has done some work. I think we'll continue to do some more. Again, I think I'm just going to encourage the audience to sort of say, let's find paths forward here where we can work together and find and graze the same ground where we're trying to grow our nectar resources and biodiverse flowers. I think we're all going to be in a better camp at the end then, because we will end up with higher biodiversity. Just have to plan for it.
So solar grazing has the potential to help agrivoltaics be part of large-scale solar. How is grazing a large-scale solar site different than a couple acre site?
Okay, great question. So it can be quite different, actually. I guess the principle I use here is you can make a big solar site small, and for planning purposes, a big solar site can be scaled over a few years in parallel with the growth of a grazing business. Mm-hmm. So a smaller farm, small to mid-sized farm, can actually probably handle a large solar site if given enough lead time. And, there will, and with the assumption that there will be equipment purchased, there will be some mowing, for example. The other thing is that a bigger solar site, it is actually, there are economies of scale, I'll put it that way.
Sure.
So, the smaller sites are DG sites, that is possible as a business model, but you need to, as a farmer grazer, you need to sort of assemble a collection of sites within a region in order to manage and actually run a viable business. I don't see a lot of other ways to do it. Just how your budget lines up, you just can't only graze one small site and actually hope to pay for your costs, your trailer, or your truck. So yeah, you need to do the math. You need to make friends with a few different developers, or just one who has a collection in your region, and then you can use the smaller sites as part of your grazing management. Stick all the ram lambs over on that western site and stick the ewes far away.
So what do solar developers need to look for in a solar grazer, and how do they prepare to manage a solar grazing site?
Yes. Solar developers should look for, I'd say, some of the following qualities. A farmer who is professional, somebody who has a tidy operation. Mm-hmm. So ideally, as the solar firm, you can go and visit another grazed site, mm-hmm. or you can go visit the farm, home base of operations, but tidiness is on the list. Experience on pasture is another quality. So you'll want that grazer to have experience in managing grass. I would say you also want references. Mm-hmm. So mm-hmm. I've had grazers volunteer that before, and it's wonderful. I've also had grazers provide kind of like a short resume, like a professional,
sure.
I got an animal science degree, great. I worked as a vet tech, fantastic. Whatever it is that's sort of relevant, not like a regular, maybe just like a little bit of a resume. Another thing would be, in an ideal world, that grazer would have had experience with targeted grazing. So I know that, as solar industry grows and solar grazing grows, increasingly we're not going to have just we need to find new grazers. So there are definitely targeted grazing opportunities out there. So if you as a solar grazer are you want to get into solar grazing, try and take on another targeted grazing job. That'll help build your resume. And then the last thing will be communication skills. If you're a farmer and you're busy during part of the year, that's all fine. But just some ability to communicate with regularity is going to be important to the solar company.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. So what about from the other perspective? What do solar grazers need to look for in a solar developer?
Okay. So this, I would say, should be done in 2 phases. And what I mean by this is, first, the grazers should do a little homework on the solar developer. So there is an amazing amount of information available on most developers' websites. Mm-hmm. And I think key questions to ask during that search are, what is the firm's business model? Do they own and operate projects or just develop them? Secondly, do they own projects that I could go see? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Third, do they have experience working with agrivoltaics, with mm-hmm. solar grazers? And lastly, what size solar projects do they build? And how does that size class match with my personal grazing ambitions?
Sure.
The second step, so once you've kind of done your homework, is to take time to build your relationship with the solar developer. That person or firm, should take the time to come out and see you, see your flock, whatever you invite them to, and see if you can then make a planned visit to an operating solar project. If a solar company representative, developer is willing to put in that kind of time, then that's probably a relationship worth investing in.
Great. Well, thanks so much for talking with me today, Lexie. It's always great to talk with you. Where can folks go to learn more?
Oh, there's the AgriSolar Clearinghouse, Stacie. Great resource. The American Solar Grazing Association.
Excellent.
And Lightsource BP has a multi-use solar projects website. So I probably provided in the chat to your readers.
Great.
Listeners. And lastly, you can email us at lightsourcebp at grazing@lightsourcebp.com. Have fun?
Excellent. Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks so much.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure, and good luck with your enterprise.
Okay, thank you.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.